Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will take you back a bit to Europe to talk about the European Emission Trading Scheme, as was just announced. My name is Bolle, and I'm responsible for EU affairs in Statkraft. And EU affairs for us is a lot about climate policy as well, because that is the European climate policies are setting the frameworks for a company like Statkraft. Let me start with some words on Statkraft. Statkraft is a leading company in hydropower internationally and Europe's largest generator of renewable power. We have around 3,600 employees in 16 countries, stretching from Europe, including Spain, where we're doing market activities, to Asia and Latin America, including Chile, where the COP originally should have been. The slide shows our activities. We have close to 20,000 megawatts installed capacity, and we manage market access for another around 20,000 megawatts, where we help smaller producers to bring their renewable energy to the markets. So we believe that markets are really important for enabling the energy transition which we need. We are the only company of our size to invest 100% of our growth into renewable energy, and that's quite remarkable. Energy consumption and production represent 3/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and more than 80% of energy is still coming from fossil fuels. That model is as old as the Industrial Revolution, about 250 years. And now we have only a few decades to change that model to a model based on renewables and low carbon fuels. That's quite a task, quite a challenge. We have done our own analysis on this, which we call the low emission scenarios. That looks a little closer on the power sector and the electricity produced in Europe, which under two scenarios. One is a 2 degree scenario, so if we keep temperature increase at a maximum of 2 degrees, and the other one is a 1.5 degree scenario, which is of course the one which we really should aim for. These are some scenarios and no prescriptions. On the left side, you see the sector as it is today with the fossil fuels, which is the gray area, amounting for more than half of the electricity generation. On the right side, you see two columns with renewable energy having a much larger share, increasing to close to 90% in the middle column under the 2 degree pathways, and being nearly 100% on the 1.5 degree pathway. These figures are for Europe, but of course something similar would need to happen in the world on a global scale. And energy production and consumption and electricity production need to change dramatically. How do we make this possible? The good news is that there are two things which pull in the same direction. It's technology and the market. On the technology side, this is our forecast for the price of solar, wind, and wind power. On the left is solar power in a typical country with high solar share and very good, not high solar share, but very good conditions for solar, like India. There, the price of new solar is not only cheaper than of new coal, but it's also getting cheaper to build new solar power that is competing with existing coal power. And that's rather promising. On the right side, you see the price for wind power in a country which has reasonable wind resources and a lot of wind already, like Germany. Their wind power is getting cheaper than new gas power. And it's also getting cheaper to buy new wind than running a gas power plant, which is already there. That is a major revolution. So wind and solar power are becoming so much more efficient and so much cheaper so quickly that it's really changing the game. The estimates for cost reductions are exceeding, or the real cost reductions actually are exceeding the estimates which were made the year before. So it's really an accelerating development. In Statkraft, we will invest approximately 1 billion euros in renewable energy on a global scale per year. And therefore, we look at these scenarios and we also look at the policies which are required. In order to do that, it's not only the costs, but we need profitability for the green solutions. We need to put the markets at work. We need to make the investments going in the right directions, and those signals need to come from the market. Without profitability and without markets pulling in that direction, then it will take too long, and we would need other costly mechanisms to support that directions. So good market solutions will keep costs down. And a part of having good markets is putting a price on carbon. We really urge governments to put a price on carbon. That's one of the topics also in these negotiations. We think that is the single most efficient measure for cutting emissions. And as much as possible of the global emissions should be covered by a price for carbon. In that context, I would like to refer to a study which was made by the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics some years ago, where we financed a professorship to conduct a study. They looked at 4 different policies which were supposed to achieve emission reductions of 25%. It was a macro model they built, a top-down macro model. They looked at 4 different these policies. One was carbon pricing. In Europe, or for the power sector, it was the ETS. It was a coal tax. It was a tax on electricity consumption. And it was technology-specific subsidies for wind, which was financed. They had 3 different alternatives on how that could be financed. But the conclusion was very clearly that carbon pricing is the most cost-efficient policy. That is not the only institute supporting that. We have heard that before, that carbon pricing is most cost-efficient. In Europe, we are so happy that we have a carbon price policy. We have had that since 2005 with the ETS. The ETS has been developed, as you know, in 4 phases. The first phase covering the years from 2005 to 2007. It was a bit learning by doing. We saw that the emission allowances were too high based on those estimated needs, and the carbon price was close to 0 when the first phase was over. The second trading period enlarged the ETS with some more countries coming in, Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. Those are the EFTA countries, and Norway is part of those, which originally was not covered by the ETS, but now is. The number of allowances was reduced, but in those years we had the financial economic crisis, which resulted in a huge economic turndown, and with that, a reduction in demand, which again resulted in huge excess supply in the ETS and relatively low prices at the end of the period. Those were carried over to the third period, but the third period was combined with a market reform. So a cap was put on the emissions, and they were reduced gradually on a yearly basis by 1.74%. So it's a progressive shift towards a lower cap during those years. And the amount of auctioned allowances was increased instead of the grandfathered allowances, which were given to many actors before, but industry is still getting grandfathered or being granted allowances. And we are just about to start, in a couple of years, the 4th trading period. The reform was done already, and the conditions for that period are settled. So the linear reduction factor on by what amount the cap is reduced has been increased to 2.2%. And there's some other changes which made the system more stable. One important change in the period which we are in are the negotiations on the market stability reserve, which was done to make the system more stable to external interruptions like economic crisis, like oversupply coming from other types of policies. And that shows the graph on the right-hand side, when the MSR was decided, the prices started to increase. And we had you see there's quite a difference. We had prices around $5-7 euros for quite a number of years, and it's now back at 20-25 euros. That changes the signal the ETS sends to producers And it changes the fuel switch, of course. In the years with the low prices, fuel switch was not as extensive as it could have been. We have actually 2 gas-fired power plants in Germany, which were nearly idle for those years because gas prices were high, coal prices were low, and the CO2 price was far too low to incentivize that switch, which is a pity in a way when you run coal instead of gas. But that has improved with the MSR coming, and we are seeing prices which are a bit higher. Why is the ETS so important for us as a power company? Well, one thing is that it is market-based. The market finds the lowest cost emission reductions. There's no need for a company like us. We know the carbon price gives the incentives or the signals which we need. We don't need to look for the areas which give the most support for renewable projects, but we can look for the best projects. The carbon price will sort that out. The emissions become part of the cost structure that change the relative prices between high and low carbon fuels. And the emission price, the carbon price, is also an internal price of the power price, which is very good. So we all see the same power price, but we have a changed cost structure because emissions get a cost. That is very good to get more renewables on stream. So it provides very clear incentives. We don't have this iterative process with subsidies. You have touched upon that. When you try something and then doesn't work, you need to change, and it goes up and down. That is a kind of regulatory risk for market participants, which is much more difficult to handle and to hedge than the price risk which is attached to the carbon price. It is also a system which is technology neutral, as we see it. It gives the same signals to all technologies. The only discrimination is between carbon and no carbon or low carbon. But all the renewable technologies are treated in the same way. That, again, leaves it to the market to find the best solutions. It is transparent. Everybody knows what the carbon price is. That is for the good and the bad, I think. It's good because it is so transparent and you see the price movements every day. It can be a disadvantage because everybody knows what the carbon price is, and it makes people perceive that as an expensive solution. They see what they need to pay to remove the CO2 from the economy. Other solutions like subsidies, nobody knows what they really cost. Some people know, but it's not very transparent, not easy to understand, and that makes people think it's cheap, but it's not. It's actually more expensive than the carbon price. But transparency as such is good, and it's good for the market and makes it easier also for people to hedge and to estimate and predict their own carbon prices, what they believe in the market. It's cost efficient, which we also have heard already. It is, and the higher the ambitions get, the more urgent it is that we go to action. It is really important that we get the most out of every euro spent, the most reductions out. And the carbon price scheme, the ETS, will help to do that. And lately, and that connects also a lot to the topic today, it provides revenues to governments. And those revenues can be earmarked. Most finance ministries don't like earmarking, but that's still a claim by many and an argument. But in any case, it provides governments with revenues which can be spent for anything, but also for climate action. The revenues are also going to finance the EU funds. The EU has an innovation fund and a modernization fund. They are financed by putting some allowances into those funds. The allowances are auctioned, and those auctions give the revenue which can be spent then on measures in countries which need support because they are most affected by the ETS. And let me just share a quick calculation with you. The annual auction volume in the EU is somewhere around 600 and 900 million tons. It changes a bit from year to year. With the prices which we had in 2016 and 17 of 5 to 6 euros, the revenues amounted to 4 to 5.5 billion euros per year. With the average price which we expect for 2019, which is around 24.5 euros, the revenues will increase to 14.6 billion. So that's nearly 3 doubling. And that is in spite of lower auction volumes. The auction volumes are 30% lower than in 2017, and still the revenues are so much higher. That makes quite a difference to the possibility for financing, both to R&D, to possibly help non-mature technologies, for compensation payments, for help to those regions which are the most affected. Will the ETS change or will it stay? There are quite a few discussions around that. We have heard about the higher targets in the EU, which are being discussed both for 2030 and for 2050. That is in a way needed to align the 2030 targets with the long-term vision for 2050. Higher targets would also increase predictability. For that, it is important to see how the burden is shared between the ETS sectors and the non-ETS sectors. That doesn't mean that the non-ETS sectors are not going to contribute and that they cannot have a carbon price or being integrated into the ETS. Which is the next point, the discussions about a possible extension of the scheme to other sectors. Some sectors are already mentioned. What we think is important to look at is what are the abatement costs in the different sectors? Are they more or less equal? Does it make sense to put those sectors into the ETS? Would it make more sense to have a similar scheme for those sectors? There are no clear answers, but important is that as many sectors as possible are covered by a market-based CO2 price. There's also the question about the effectiveness of a carbon price. If you have a product which has a lot of other taxes already on it, the carbon price will only be a small share of the total price. That might not give a strong signal and incentive to change. So the carbon price needs to be effective also for the end consumer as a signal. It is important to avoid rigidity in supply. That is an issue with the ETS, that you have a cap which is reduced gradually, but it's not really responsive to changes in demand, which you would see in a normal market. This is a slightly different market because supply is not quite as flexible. To make that supply more adjustable and automatically adjusting to changes in demand is important. I mentioned already that market reserves, the market stability reserve, that is one means of making the supply more responsive. There could also be other mechanisms which reflect changes in demand due to other types of policies, which also affect the ETS sectors. So you could have a mechanism which automatically removes those allowances which are freed up because you have renewable policies or energy efficiency policies from the ETS, so that the signals and the tightness in the ETS is kept strong. There are discussions about a carbon border tax adjustment. You could see that as the other side of carbon leakage. It is carbon leakage often results in carbon import, and we might need to avoid carbon import as well in order to become carbon neutral in Europe. That is the ambition. That's being discussed as well. Again, no clear signals from our side on what is the right thing, but possibly it would make the discussions in the ETS simpler, because industry is also part of the ETS and has partly to buy and is partly granted the allowances, and would make it, and they need compensation for that because they are competitive. They compete with products coming from outside the ETS. Having another type for protection from that kind of competition would maybe make it easier to have an even stronger ETS. What is really important is that we keep the ETS as strong and as effective as possible and as a core instrument for climate policies, that we consider ETSs for other sectors, and that we apply carbon pricing for all goods and products, which makes it easier to give those signals further to the economy. It also eases electrification, which we think is important with clean energy to help decarbonize other sectors. Having a carbon price signal in that is important for us as well. I think I leave it with that. Thank you.